Howdy, folks. Thanks for checking into Mr. Ulrich's Land of Biology. I, of course, am Mr. Ulrich, and this charming old fellow is the big name in evolution, Chucky D, Charles Darwin himself. Now, some people will know him as the inventor or discoverer of evolution, and those people would be wrong. Because he did neither of those things. The idea that organisms had changed over time was not new in his day in the mid-19th century. Among other things, because he wrote and studied a lot of different stuff. When he was a young guy, here he is, shortly after marrying his cousin, he embarked on a voyage around South America for the British government. And he would stop at different places. He went all around South America on the Beagle. But one of the places that he stopped at as he was collecting fossils and different animal specimens and plants, he stopped at the Galapagos. And one of the things he noticed on the Galapagos is how each island had its own different, its own distinct bird, finch, that had its own beak. And they all kind of resembled each other and the mainland. But each island had a different finch that seemed to be perfect for the types of seeds and the types of resources that were there. And then he left and came back and noticed that the islands had actually changed over time. And then he this is a page from his notebook here, he kind of got this idea, and I love the top of it. Right up at the top it says, I think. He got this idea of how the changing environment could influence the changing of organisms that are found in those environments. This is the first cladogram that was ever made, and we'll do cladograms later on in class. Well, if Darwin didn't discover evolution, then why the heck are we still talking about him? Well, what he's most famous for is, among other things, is taking these different concepts that were studied at the time that people knew about, and kind of stringing them together into a single kind of cohesive explanation as to how organisms changed over time. He developed a mechanism for evolution. And he did this, like I said, by putting together these concepts. One of the concepts was that organisms that were all snowflakes, that organisms are not identical to one another. Even penguins are genetically distinct from one another. He was also a student of this gentleman, Thomas Malthus, who was a economist. And Thomas Malthus is famous, again, among other things, for recognizing the relationship between population size, population growth, and resource availability, and that as populations grow, they tend to grow faster than resource availability grows. And that means that not all organisms are going to get what they need. This is a direct result of overproduction. This tendency of populations to make more babies than are needed to replace the previous generations as they die off. You put all this together, not enough resources, and you end up with competition between individuals for those limited resources. And we have to be careful when we're talking about competition. The tendency is to think of two, lions, like, put them up, going toe to toe. That's my piece of meat. Give me that donut, right? And it's not always going to be a direct fight, although sometimes it is. It can also be which organism is just better at getting up in the morning and getting to the resources earlier than the others, or waiting later, waiting for those resources to be available. Having the strategy that allows it to get what it needs. And we call these characteristics adaptations. These characteristics that make an organism best suited for the environment that it finds itself in. And again, we have to be careful with this term as well. We're talking adaptations. We're not talking about a verb. You and I are evolutionarily stagnant. We are not going to adapt. We can't evolve. But you and I are as adapted as we can be, and hopefully we're well adapted for the environment that we're in, so that we're successful in passing our genes on to the next generation. And all this together becomes what we call natural selection. And a great example of this, classic example of natural selection, took place amongst the population of peppered moths in Great Britain, in a concept called industrial melanism. It goes something like this. Um, Way back before the Industrial Revolution, there was population, or there is still a population of what are called peppered moths that grow in Great Britain. And they range in hue, in color from kind of this charcoal gray to light colored. And before the Industrial Revolution, the trunks of the trees are nice and light colored. And of course, that means that if you're a light colored moth, bully for you, you're going to blend in and not get eaten by the birds. And there was counted and seen a shift in the population towards light colored moths. There were still a few darker colored moths in there, but predominantly light colored moths. And then the Industrial Revolution came by, we burn a whole lot of coal, and the trees start to get a little bit darker. And lo and behold, we see a shift in the relative amounts of light versus dark moths. We see a shift from mostly light to mostly dark, as being a darker colored moth, and now you actually blend in better. And then of course we had the industrial burned basically all the coal that there was available in Great Britain, and the trees started to lighten up again, and we saw a shift back to lighter colored peppered moths. It's helpful for us to be able to compare natural selection to selective breeding. Both of those processes are going to yield a population of organisms that have more of a desired trait. It's really just a matter of who's choosing the trait as being desirable. In selective breeding, a breeder selects the horses that have the fastest traits and allows them to breed, and so the next population that he has, all the next colts, hopefully have those traits. In the case of natural selection, it's actually the natural environment that is making the decision as to which traits are going to be beneficial or not. Maybe having all of this muscle mass to be able to run fast isn't going to help it if the horse finds itself living in a forest, I guess. I don't know. And where it's not as well adapted, perhaps being narrower and smaller, like a little deek or something like that might be better adapted. At this point, we should take a sec to codify a definition of natural selection in our notes. So natural selection goes like this. Those individuals of the population who have what it takes to survive in an environment will probably do that, survive in the environment long enough to have babies who will inherit their have what it takes genes, and they will live on and do the same thing. Now, this is not, and I know it's not exactly what I have there, but close enough for rock and roll. And this is not what Darwin's definition. Yep, that's another picture of Chucky D there. This is not pretty severe looking look in his face there, isn't it? Anyway, this would not be his definition. Why? What are some things in this definition that Darwin couldn't possibly know about? Well, one of his, it's called Darwin's black box. One of the things that he didn't know about is this idea of genes, that DNA is the kind of inheriting material. He was doing his work. He was studying right around the same time, a little after Gregor Mendel was doing his work. And so no one read about Gregor Mendel. Darwin had no idea, as far as I know, who he was. And it took this guy, T.H. Morgan, to really kind of seal the idea that chromosomes and DNA had something to do with the inheriting of traits, of characteristics. And the term gene didn't come along until this guy, William Bateson, coined the term gene to talk about sections of DNA that correspond to particular traits. Natural selection does a great job of explaining how a trait like dark-wingedness amongst peppered moths can shift over time as one generation dies out and is replaced by the next generation, from being mostly dark-winged moths to fewer dark-winged moths and more light-winged moths. But that's within a single population. when we start to see natural selection happening differently to a population or to different populations, that's when we start to see one population develop one way on one, what we call it, an evolutionary trajectory, and the other one develop in a different direction. It goes kind of like this. You start out with a single population, and all of the individuals are similar enough to interbreed, and they can all meet one another essentially in order to do that. But something happens. So that now, instead of having one contiguous population, we have fragmented it. And they are still similar enough, they could hypothetically still interbreed, but they're physically kept from intermingling. This is called geographic isolation. And then we get natural selection happening. It's always happening. If those two different environments now are different from one another, one might be the same, and maybe one of those populations got blown onto a different island or something, like, say, one of Darwin's finches, or a group of Darwin's finches from mainland got blown onto a particular island. Right now, they have a different set of environments, they have different resources, and so they have different things that are going to select for different traits. And we call this differential natural selection. We have different selective pressures. All right, and over time, those groups are going to evolve. One's going to evolve one way, the other's going to evolve another way. And as this change from generation to generation takes place, you can eventually get enough changes so that now the two populations are genetically distinct enough that even if they can interbreed, they still can't. If they can meet to do the deed, they can't make reproductively viable offspring. They have achieved what we call reproductive isolation. So now it's not the road or the river or the mountain range that's splitting the population in two and keeping them from breeding. It's really just the fact that they're two separate, distinct populations, two separate, distinct, I should say, species that can't interbreed anymore. Well, I'm going to leave it at that for now. We're going to use the speciation of hominins as our example, and I'll get into that in the next video. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or drop them in the comment section if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're doing an ed puzzle, you're going to get an opportunity to ask me questions. Other than that, we'll see you in class hopefully very, very soon.